I'd like to call onto the stage Rod Baxter. Kia ora, Rod. Everyone give a round of a hand for Rod.
Ata Māori e whānau. Hey, I'm just the hype man to introduce our first keynote speaker this morning. And I am just so pumped. I have been waiting for this moment, no pressure, Whaia Jose, for this keynote this morning, because who we're about to welcome to the stage is a prophet in our sector, a rangatira and a kaipara huarahi, a trailblazer who has forged a path for us where there was no path before. Whaia Josie was a youth worker in Wellington and Pōneke in the 70s, and around the time of the YDSA, the Youth Development Strategy that the Ministry of then Youth Affairs published in 2002, there was a companion resource that many of us know about called E Tipu I Rea that Josie developed with rangatahi through wānanga, marae-based wānanga, and E Tipu I Rea became Josie's book, Ngā Reanga Youth Development Māori Styles, that was published in 2014. And the really significant thing in terms of Josie's prophecies and rangatiratanga is represented and immortalised in the name of Arataiohi. Arataiohi chose consciously the kupu taiohi because of Josie's whakaaro in E Tipu I Rea on page 7 that clarified for us, and you can do the research about why this is the case, that the kupu rangatahi was problematic. And the kupu taiohi and some of the other variations like tai tamariki, te mea, that taiohi was more appropriate in the whakaaro around that. And that has been immortalised. Your whakaaro and your reminding us of that wisdom has been immortalised in the name of our peak body in Arataiohi. And I'm just going to finish this. I checked this with Whaia Josie to ground us before we welcome her to the stage in the whakatauaki E Tipu I Rea. In 1949, Apirana Ngāta wrote in the autograph book of a schoolgirl. Her name was Rangi Bennett. And he wrote, E tipu, e rea, mō ngā rā o tau ao, ko tō ringa ki ngā rākau a te Pākehā, hei ora mō te tinana. Ko tau ngākau ki ngā taonga a o tipuna Māori hei tiki mō tō mahuna. Ko tō wairua ki tō atua, nana ngai ngā mea katoa. Thrive in the days destined for you. Your hand to the tools of the Pākehā to provide physical sustenance. Your heart to the treasures of your ancestors to adorn your head. Your soul to God to whom all things belong. This has become a much quoted and referenced vision for taiohi, for Māori youth, and much like Apirana Ngāta, who has given us that wisdom, let's put our hands together for the weaver who has grounded us in that, Whaia Josie Keelan.
Ahua makariri a wau I tēnei ata. I'm a bit cold this morning, so if I start to wiri, it's because I am cold. Tēnā rā koe e Rod mō o kōrero mō hau I tēnei ata. Tata tonu ka noho mātou, tātou katoa, ki roto I te wā o matariki, me tērā o ngā whetū ko pohu te kawa. Nō reira, ka huri ngā whakaaro ki a rātou mā kua whitu rangitia I te tau kua haere nei. Rātou kei tuo te ārai, me ki e moi mai rā, rātou ki a rātou. Ka huri wāku nei whakaaro, ki a tātou te hunga ora e tai atu nei I runga te karanga o tēnei o tātou nei hui. Tēnā koutou katoa, koutou ngā tai o hinga, koutou ngā whānau me ngā rōpu mai I ngā hāpori, I haere mai ki te tautoko I te kaupapa. Koutou ngā kaimahi, kei te mahi I te mahi ki te awhi, tautoko, aki, poipoia, te kaupapa o te whakahiato tai o hinga. Ki ngā kai whakahaere o tēnei hui, tēnā koutou mō te tono, Kia hara mai au au, hai kai kōrero, ko waiahau, ko waiahau, ko waiahau. Nō reira, tēnā koutou a tēnā tātou katoa. I had great plans to go all flash with polls and things, but I ran out of time. So no flash PowerPoint, just a plain one, no bells, whistles, all things whiz bang, so hopefully my kōrero can keep you awake and keep you engaged, if for a little. Nō reira, kia ora koutou. I've got to remember everybody's around. So, I'm not very good at talking about myself, so thank you, Rod, for providing some sort of a background about who I am. And, but if you're wondering why Nana is talking to you this morning, and because you've never heard of me, perhaps a little bit more extension on what Rod has mentioned this morning to add to what you read about me in the program. My involvement in youth development did begin in the 1970s, so yes, you know, it's okay for me to call myself Nana. And I participated in actions like the petition for Te Reo Māori to be taught in schools. And we provided legal advice, employment advice and housing advice for young Māori and Pacific people in Pōneke and Wellington at the time, because I was living in Wellington then. And our legal aid program that we had in the courts, in the Magistrates Court in the 1970s, was the forerunner of the current legal aid program. So basically we provided the model for what currently exists. And we ran it all on the smell of an oily rag. We used to pay we had two workers, Te Ata Witihira and Ted Nia. Ted has since passed on and is buried in his other homeland, which is in Rarotonga. And we used to pay them $10 a week. Imagine that, $10 a week for working with young people in the court system. We also had a house for street kids in Wellington. They used to call them street kids in those days. And we worked really well on that while we, until such time as we found out that the police were investigating us for running a brothel. We couldn't figure that out because we were pimply-faced, you know, 20-year-olds who had no shoes because the shoes used to go missing. We wore hand-me-down clothes, so we couldn't figure out how the police would think that we were running a house, a brothel at the time. It was that experience that really taught me the need for proper training and education of youth workers, because we had no idea what we were doing, and when I look back on it, I think we probably did more damage than we actually did any good. And I say that because one of the young people that we worked with committed suicide behind the Purple Onion, which was a strip club, and he was stripping in the club at the time. Another one was driving a truck, a car that they had converted. And they ran into the back of a milk truck and decapitated themselves. Some others beat up and killed an old alcoholic man in a famous case that was known as the telephone box case in Wellington. And a couple of others, they beat their father to death. He was a terribly violent person. They beat their father to death. So that experience actually taught me that I knew diddly squat about being a youth worker, and that most youth workers in the 1970s actually didn't know what they were doing. And there was a real need for youth work training and education. Later, I was a youth worker with the YWCA here in Tāmaki, and provided support for other youth workers. I went to PNG as a VSA volunteer and worked for almost 2 years establishing the Urban Youth Program. And when I came back from PNG, I was unemployed for a while, but a member of Peter Tapsell's Youth Advisory Committee, so kia ora to anybody who's in the Youth Advisory Committee and those ones who were here the other day. And one of the weird things was that I was the only person on that committee that never received any payment because I was unemployed, and you can't receive 2 payments from the government. A couple of years later, I managed a Pacific-wide youth development program for the United Nations Development Program. And we would take volunteers from one Pacific country to another Pacific country. In PNG, that just confirmed for me the need for youth workers training and education. And my mentor at the time was this loudmouthed, really foul-mouthed Australian. And I just absolutely admired the way in which he worked as a manager of youth development. And in that work, I also worked with the governments of various Pacific countries in looking at how they could develop national youth development programs. While I was doing that work, I was based in Samoa and would travel across the Pacific. I came back to Aotearoa and worked on developing the diploma in youth development that used to be at AUT alongside my friend Jane Foster. It later became a major of the Bachelor of Māori Development, and I know there was at least one graduate of the program here at the conference. Are you still here, Melissa? Carl. Where? Oh, kia ora, Melissa. And unfortunately, the program no longer exists, but we do have the program down in Petone at, what is it? Welltech Te Pūkenga. And I say Welltech Te Pūkenga because I'm actually on the council for Te Pūkenga. My master's was about a model of youth development to be found in the Whakatauaki e Te Puerea, written by Tā Apirana Ngāti for Rangi Barcham, who was the daughter of the late Sir John Bennett. My doctorate is on a model to grow young Māori entrepreneurs to be found in the Māui stories, because for me, Māui was an ultimate entrepreneur, and we can learn so much from him, both the good, the bad, and the absolute ugly. He also features in stories throughout the Pacific, so he is a unifying ancestor for us all. Now that I've just, blown my own trumpet for a little bit, like many keynote speakers, I started with an idea that changed several times. So I've landed on this, and I gave it the title, How to Youth Develop in an Election Year. Whether or not I say true to that kōrero is a moot point, but we shall see. It's an election year, and true to form, the various political parties spend money trying to convince us that they are the best party to govern. What does that mean in a youth development context? So let's take a look at what they are saying and the impact that has on the youth development. Thank you. That's what happens when you're cold. Your nose just runs and you end up sniffing. Thank you. So let's look at what they're saying and the impact that has on the youth development sector. You could say it's all negative and positions young people as criminals and deviants, and that makes the job of those who work with young people hard. You could say they're about creating jobs and opportunities through education and training and a growing economy, so that's positive. Electioneering is fraught with emotion. So how do you navigate those choppy seas and find the calm? So let's take some kōrero about the upcoming elections and about the campaigning that's occurring at the moment and the party policies that have our attention, yours and mine. So, whoops. So I'm going to give you 3 to 5 minutes to kōrero to the person next to you about voting, if you're going to vote and why. By the way, if you're eligible to vote, you know that the Electoral Commission's been here for the last 3 days and you've been able to go and vote, enroll, sorry. If you are going to vote and why, if you intend to boycott the elections and why, I've boycotted the elections a couple of times. If you think the voting age should be lowered to 16, as has been proposed a number of times over the years, and anything else about the elections. So, e te iwi, kōrero mai, kōrero atu, kei a koutou te wā. Have a chat. Ngā iwi e, kia ko te hira te moana nui a ki wā. Ngā iwi e, kia ko te hira te moana nui a ki wā. Ia whakarongo tautoko. Ia whakarongo tautoko. Kia ora. We're just singing the first verse, that's koina noiho. Mo tēnei wā. Some of you probably said you were going to vote because it is your democratic right. Koina? Some of you would have also argued it is your democratic right not to vote. Some of you would have said elections are a load of crap where politicians promise things and don't follow through. At least that's what you've heard and experienced. Some of you are waiting for the day when you can vote. Some of you don't know what it all means, and some of you are wondering how you can tell the truth from all the noise that is out there in the lead up to an election. I was heartened to see the Electoral Commission had a stall here, and I saw at least one person complete an enrolment form. I understood the person I overheard saying they weren't going to vote. Like I've said, I've boycotted the elections a couple of times, both for political reasons, because I didn't think that the government or the parties were going to do enough for Māori. For those working in youth development, the noise leading up to an election can promise much and can be incredibly disappointing. So let's have a look at youth development in an election year. First thing we need to understand is that an election campaign starts the day after the last election took place. So that means campaigning for this election actually began on the 18th of October 2020, because the last election took place the day before, and in a good MMP mixed member proportion environment, Labour, with the Greens in a confidence and supply agreement, formed the government. That is probably a surprise to you because most of you, because the way our system works, most of us think that campaigning begins like it is at the moment, begins when the election date is announced, then each political party has a campaign launch at some time after, and we hear a lot in the media about the policies, especially if they are one of the big six. What they don't tell us is that all that bluff and bluster in the Parliament building down in Wellington, or when the Prime Minister, ministers and MPs are making speeches, like the Minister did the other day, and having photos taken at this event and the other one down the road, the questions in the House, the press releases on this, that and the other thing, those are all part of the campaigning. And it's not just about running the country. The parties who form the government are in power are campaigning to stay in power, and the opposition, that is all the parties that are wanting to be in power, are working hard to have us believe that the current government, whoever that may be, is not doing a good job, and therefore we should vote for them. Both sides do whatever it takes to convince us that they are the better choice, and this time around it is getting a little, if not downright dirty. So what are the biggies for youth development? Before going into that, please talk to the people around you again about the policy of one of the political parties that has caught your attention. Koro atu, kōrero mai, kei a koutou te wā. Kia maura ki te mana motu hake me te aroha. Kia maura, ki te mana motu hake me te aroha. Ia, whakarongo tautoko. Ia, whakarongo tautoko. Okay, so what are the big headlines? Let's have some feedback from in the house. Samora and Mita are going to go around with the microphone. Anybody want to contribute? Say what you think the biggies are?
Boot camps.
Boot camps?
Big one.
Kia ora.
And changing the way that sentencing works for young people and encouraging judges to give more punitive responses in the way that they sentence.
Kia ora. Somebody had a hand up over there.
Tēnā tātou. I do think that a lot of people aren't happy with the current government and are sort of looking for alternatives and are seeing, you know, the other big one, which is national, which is a bit worrying for
Kia
me.
ora.
Fire, we have another response here.
Kei hea
Kia ora. You get so disillusioned that you wonder if your vote has anything to do with youth development. So looking at policies and things like that, when you feel like under one power, you've got not enough happening, and then the other promise is to cut social spending in general, doesn't seem like you want to vote for anybody or encourage our young people to vote for anybody. So policy or not, you know, at least we've got the youth sector here.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. Like our boy said, the focus is on our rangatahi, and a lot of the focus is the big headlines and the crimes and all that. But we're not actually looking at the source of that crime. They're looking at our rangatahi as the source. They're blaming them. But the source, you don't lock up the knife for stabbing someone. So yeah, just them using our rangatahi and using it for a ploy to gain votes or whatever, that's not the focus. Yeah, so kia ora. Sorry.
Kia ora. Thank you. Kia ora. Well, I'm just looking at the clock thing down here. Is that for me? I just saw the clock thing and it's ticking down. So can we trust the headlines? You know, the big headlines have been around youth crime. So can we trust the headlines? Are the politicians informed? And what is the truth? What is the truth? So Derek Cheng, I have to go and look back and look at my notes. In an excellent in-depth article, Derek Cheng wrote for the New Zealand Herald. He noted that recorded youth crime has been in freefall since 2007. Now, we all know that. So he then provides some numbers. In 2007, just over 5,010 to 16-year-olds faced charges, and last year fewer than 1,000 for that age group did so. Despite that, he reports that 87% of us, and I'm saying we're included in part of that, the public believe youth crime has increased. Why? I'd hazard a guess that the belief has more to do with a number of things, news reporting being primarily amongst it, and our response to the news reporting, and whose voice is the loudest, and it certainly isn't likely to be any of us in the room today. So what do the political parties most likely to be in the House after the election, what I'm calling the Big Five, or Big Six, say their response to youth crime will be, should they be elected? Keep in mind that the age group the political parties usually reference when they talk about youth crime are 12 to 17-year-olds. So those of you who are 18 to 24, you're off the hook on this one. They do not talk about 18 to 24-year-olds because in the justice system they are classed as adults. On a side note, political party policies are not written by the MPs nor by the leaders of their political parties. Each party has a policy group who draft the policies that are then usually passed at the party annual general meeting. But the leaders of those political parties and the various spokespersons, be they ministers or shadow ministers on the opposition, are the ones who generally talk about those party policies. And so they tend to get the focus on them. So keep in mind that the policies are actually written by this other group that we know nothing about. In fact, some of you actually might be on some of those policy writing groups. Let's start with the youth crime or youth justice or justice-related policies of the two parties currently in power, Labour and the Greens. So, Chris Hipkins, the Prime Minister, has had a gutsful. Labour's policy related to youth crime include those who influence youth crime will face additional punishments made possible by a law or laws enabling judges to make those punishments. I'm guessing that the Labour Party and their policy group based the policy on the assumption that youth crime is organised by gangs and is part of an initiation process. That may be so in some cases, but definitely not all. Often youth crime is more opportunistic rather than organised and planned. Right? Opportunistic. See an empty house, let's go and have a look. Right? Let's go and have a jack. See a shop over there, let's go have a look. I'm with my mates in a car, let's go do a ram raid. It has nothing to do with being planned. It's an opportunity that has been taken advantage of. Would you believe I had 4 layers on and I was still makariri. Labour also says that publishing criminal behaviour online will be considered by judges as an aggravating factor in sentencing. Isn't that already being done? So why do we need a law? Who is going to monitor this? Probably New Zealand Police using their high-tech crime division. New Zealand Police has a social media policy and it is available for you to have a look at online. Okay? I downloaded it because I wanted to know if they had any policies around using social media for overt and covert investigations. On page 14, it outlines that and says what police can and can't do when it comes to social media and whether or not they can use social media in order to be able to incriminate somebody. It says that they're not allowed to, but that doesn't mean to say that they don't. Okay? It just says they're not allowed to. Also included in their policy document is the one that you might be interested in because it got quite a bit of publicity last year, and that is the use of content regarding youth, and that is the taking of photos of young people. Last year there was quite a bit of controversy around the number of young Māori males that were having photos taken of them by the police, and the fact that it is illegal for the police to actually do that. And it's covered in that particular policy document that is available to you online. So those of you who work with young people who constantly are harassed or spoken to by the police or investigated, go and have a look at that policy document. It's really useful, okay? The Greens and youth crime, they want, this is probably one of the better policy documents when it comes to youth crime. Obviously, a Greens supporter in the House. They're talking about resource-based, evidence-based, resourcing evidence-based rehabilitation, okay? That's a good move. They want to expand the specialist youth courts throughout the country. Currently, there are 15 rangatahi courts, and there are 2 Pasifika rangatahi courts, both of which are here in Tāmaki. So they want to expand that a little bit more. You would think that there would be more also Pasifika courts in places like Tokoroa, in places like Wellington and Porirua, and also in Christchurch and in Invercargill. There are large communities of Pacific people who live in Invercargill, who live in Christchurch. So you would think that there would be more Pasifika courts around the country. They talk about supporting young people to address the causes of their offending. I'd say they're talking about providing better resourcing to the support services that exist. At least that is what I trust they are talking about, because support services already exist and they need better resourcing. They want to minimise the use of remand and youth detention centres, hopefully, I say, by better resourcing community support services. They want to ban the detention of young people in adult prisons, which is a good thing. They want to reform bail and sentencing laws by having non-custodial sentencing, and extend legal aid and better resourcing of community law centres. The Greens talk a lot of sense. They're not getting caught up in the emotional rhetoric. We can look at those policy statements and think, aye, those make a lot of sense. Unfortunately, they stop at better resourcing, but perhaps that is in the detail of their policies. So go have a look at the detail of all of the political parties' policies. Now to consider the policies of the opposition, and this is when it gets a bit ugly. Luxon, the would-be Prime Minister, the Prime Minister in waiting, has also had a guts fall. National policies related to youth crime include creating a young serious offender category aimed at ram raiders and other serious assaults. This kind of already exists, so you have to wonder at the purpose of this category. It reads like the kind of policy to include when you want to look like you're doing something without really having to do anything. It's likely to be one of those policies that slips down the list of things to do once you get in the house. They want to introduce the young offender military academies where 15 to 17-year-olds would be sent for a year. Military academies and boot camps have been tried before, and they are not always successful. In some cases, they are downright unsuccessful and often do not last for very long. There are a couple of military academies in country, but like the Vanguard Military School for years 11, 12 and 13 in Albany, and ATC, which is part of the New Zealand Skills and Education Program, and is more targeted towards military preparation. Neither is the kind of military academy National is talking about. Military-style academies only work if somebody chooses to go to one. If one is forced to go to one, they do not work. They have a rate of failure that is quite high. Jared Gilbert, a sociologist at Canterbury University, spoke to the fact that although military-style schools are popular worldwide, there is evidence to suggest they do not work. Most of that evidence comes from the US, where there are heaps of those military academies, and they keep good data. So because they keep good data, there is evidence to demonstrate how unsuccessful military academies are. Also, the evidence says that if you want to have an academy that is going to make a difference, a 12-month-long stint is not going to do it. National proposes the academies would be delivered in partnership between the Defence Force and other providers. Those who back military academies are usually older, been in one of the services, or have had whānau in the services. Although National does not refer to them, boot camps also have poor outcomes and can create long-term psychological issues for those sent to them. So why do we keep on constantly going back to those two ideas, thinking that they will make a difference? Probably a lack of ideas. So we fall back on what we have tried before and hope like hell that this time it's going to work. National wants to back police to tackle gangs. Police already do this, that is, tackle gangs. We don't need them to have any more power and authority than they do. The police find ways in which to work with gangs by establishing communications and working relationships. They have learned over time that this is the best way to work with gangs, and so-called get tough on crime, yes, has an immediate effect by incarcerating members of gangs and their associates, but does not work in the long term. And all the evidence provides us with that information. We know that. And yet here's National yet again saying we need to get tough on gangs. It does not address the underlying reasons why gangs are part of our social fabric, which was what the brother over here was talking about. National also wants to empower communities to tackle youth crime. Communities are already doing what they can to tackle youth crimes, and they do not need governments to empower them. Communities have been doing the mahi since forever, and you, in the room, are the evidence. What communities need are resources, especially funding, and not funding that is cut off after 3 years because somehow or another they're supposed to become self-sufficient. Something they can't do when their focus is on the young people they are working with. ACT and youth crime. Seymour, the wannabe PM, talks tough when presenting ACT's policies related to youth crime. And the first thing they want to do is for 17-year-olds to be dealt with as adults in the adult justice system, but not necessarily sent to adult prison. They want to reinstate the 3-strike legislation. This just fills up prisons. So the next policy will be to build more prisons or to expand the ones that we currently have. The idea of 3 strikes comes from the US, which is the country that has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. And so why do we want to be like the States? I wouldn't have a clue. They also have an increasing number of privatisations of prisons. We have one prison that is privatised and is run by Serco. Serco is paid a bonus if they are able to demonstrate that anybody who leaves their system does not return. Okay, so there are bonuses paid to private prisons, both our one as well as the ones in the States and elsewhere in the world, if they are able to demonstrate that their rates of recidivism are lower than the national or the state paid prisons. It would be interesting to really understand how they actually collect that data. The Act wants to cut funding for cultural reports, and this to me demonstrates an absolute lack of understanding of what a cultural report is. I think Act thinks cultural reports about Māoris getting special treatment again, although in the paper yesterday I think it was saying that to them it's just a waste of money. But those reports are more focused on the environment in which the person has been raised and is currently living in. One's ethnic culture is just one aspect, and it is a small aspect of a cultural report. And I know that from having written at least one cultural report in my life. ACT is also talking about an increase of 200 new youth justice beds under corrections. I'm guessing that has something to do with the policy statement about 17-year-olds facing adult court. This will only exacerbate the care or school to prison trajectory, and in the long term will not help. Likewise, ACT's next policy of instant practical penalties, progressing to ankle bracelets, progressing to secure facilities, is a policy that reinforces that trajectory of care or school to prisons. It is a reflection of a lack of care, a lock 'em up and throw away the key attitude. Tracy McIntosh from the University of Auckland talks about the trajectory, and once in the system, prison is inevitable unless services, support systems and caring are wrapped around a young person right at the beginning. Incarceration should be the least preferred outcome, and as Derek Cheng reported in his article, the current system works to do all that it can to keep taiohinga off the trajectory. The Māori Party and youth crime. The Māori Party does not have policies that specifically address young people. Its policies are in two areas, oranga whānau and oranga whenua. However, the Māori Party does have a criminal justice policy. Now, the fact that it doesn't have specific policies to young people, you can either take that as a real plus or you can take that as a real negative. So it's a plus in terms of seeing young people as being part of their whānau and part of their community. It's a negative because it doesn't actually look at any of the things that specifically affect young people. They want to establish a Māori legal service or defence legal service, implement a parallel restorative Māori criminal justice system based on tikanga Māori, which aims to rehabilitate and reintegrate offenders and victims as contributing members of the communities, and to stamp out racism at all levels in the justice system. They want to legislate the code of ethics for the police. The police actually do have a code of ethics. Again, it is available to you if you want to go and explore the New Zealand Police website. And I would presume that signing up on the day that they sign up and the day that they fall out of the academy, the police academy, that they're signing up to that code of behaviour. Again, it's around how do you monitor all of that? You know, how do you keep an eye on the police to ensure that they are practicing their code of ethics? They want to require police officers to wear body cams. Good idea, though, although in the US it has not prevented poor judgment on the part of police. It does and has been used to provide evidence in cases brought against the police. Māori Party wants evaluation surveys of policing in high Māori population communities. Useful in urban areas, but in places like where I come from, Ruatoria and Uwawa, I'm kind of wondering at the value of such a policy, because you know in those communities the population is around about 90% Māori, and there's one police officer, and that one police officer becomes part of, inculcated into the community, so I'm just wondering how that works. They want to halve the prison population by repealing the Bail Amendment Act, and they want to repeal the 3 strikes rule, as it does not align with restorative justice. They have something about ensuring gun laws reflect the responsible use of firearms to meet customary obligations. And not sure what that means by customary obligations. Maybe it's about sharing the wild pig that they just shot over the weekend. So I was kind of wondering, what does customary obligations when it comes to firearms actually means? They've got a whole lot of other things there too, which is really focused on the Māori community, particularly. And I'm talking about the community as a whole. Their focus is on restorative justice and on the fact that those most likely to be in our justice system are Māori, because all the evidence tells us that Māori are the ethnic group most likely to be on the worst end of the justice system. New Zealand First in youth crime. Now, Papa Winston is making a bid to get back into the House. He always talks tough, does Papa Winston. New Zealand First related youth crime policies include, and this is the scariest one, gangs will be designated terrorist entities under the Terrorism Suppression Act of 2022. It's the scariest of all of the policies that I had a look at. A terrorist is defined in the Oxford Dictionary as a person who uses unlawful violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in pursuit of political aims. Academics argue that it is really difficult to define terrorism, really difficult. So why would gangs be designated terrorist entities? It is argued that there is no prospect for a fully adequate definition of terrorism. The definition will inevitably be over-inclusive. A number of reasons explain this, but the central reason is that courts lack the expertise to distinguish between adequately legitimate political resistance from terrorism. Usually when gangs use unlawful violence and intimidation, it is seldom, if at all, used against the general population. Instead, it is against other gangs, and the political aim, if you can call it a political aim, is to assert their control over their space, turf, call it what you will. It is a show of power. It is rare that a gang uses violence and intimidation against the rest of society. However, many of us feel intimidated when we see gang members, or even a gathering of people who actually don't look like us. And really, I think that that's a telling thing, is we're intimidated by people who don't look like us. All that the policy will do is fill the youth detention centres and adult prisons, so we have to spend more money building more prisons and expanding the prisons we've got. They say that being a gang member will, by law, be an aggravating factor. I'd say this already exists, so this is another one of those policies for effect more than anything else. They want to increase the number of youth aid officers. Any addition of these who work with young people and who are good, well-trained and well-intentioned youth aid officers who are focused on halting that trajectory I talked about earlier, and is welcome. And I say this from the point of view, if you think about who is one of our best advocates for in the justice system area, and that's Tā Kim Workman. And Tā Kim Workman started out as a youth aid officer in the 1970s. There's more detail on each of the parties, but generally these are the main focus of their policies. 2 are focused on restorative justice, 2 on punitive justice, and 1 moving between the 2 because it wants to look tough, but good tough if there is such a thing. In a youth development context, what does that mean? Likely, those working in the sector trying to point out that the young people who are doing the ram raids and causing mayhem generally are a minority. They're usually around 4 to 7% of the total youth population, okay? Usually. Those in the youth development sector are pointing out to anyone who will listen that all the evidence tells us that military style and boot camps are not successful, that the focus should be on the causes of youth crime, like the brother said earlier. Poverty, poor education outcomes, lack of knowledge of one's rights within the system, and institutional racism rather than crime. That all the proposed policies do is increase our prisoner population. But I suppose for that 87% of us who think crime is on the increase, locking them up and throwing away the key makes us feel safe. None of us think about the fact that the majority of prisoners come back among us after they have served their term. What happened to the policies on rehabilitation? Unfortunately, those who work in youth development end up talking to ourselves, or talking amongst ourselves. So what can we do, or what can you do? Understand how the political system works and how marginalised groups can organise to influence it. Talk to the youth leaders in each of the political parties, because they do have youth sectors within each of the political parties. Every political party has a youth branch. Most are led by those who are in their 20s and therefore still taiohinga. School them on the realities of their party's policies before they are too entrenched in wanting to become an MP and following the party line. Appeal to their identity as young people and not as party members. I saw a few people wearing political party merch on Monday. May I suggest you take a hard look at your party's policies and our greenie over here, all of the party's policies, and consider the impact of those policies on the group for whom you are here, Taiohinga. Identify the most trusted people in the youth development sector who can advocate to MPs in Parliament, target backbenchers on either side who want to make a name for themselves and have ambition to be in Cabinet, feed them the stories and the information. Make a point of regularly attending your MPs, local MPs, clinic or office and keep them up to date on what's happening in youth development in their electorate. During the most transparent campaigning period, like now, go to the candidates' public meetings and ask them about the policies that impact young people. Point out the positives and especially those policies that you know will not work for young people. Ask those who have been effective advocates for lessons in advocacy. And those people don't have to be alive or dead, you know. A few of the dead ones have got books written about them. Okay? Those who have been around for ages get together and work out a strategy to promote positive youth development, and not just for your organisation, but for the sector. So I've known a few really good advocates, but when they went in, they just really went in to advocate for their own organisation. If you go in to advocate, please advocate for the sector as a whole and not just for your organisation. Use the academics like myself. We can write and advocate, and we carry on doing so even when society generally thinks we haven't got a clue as to what goes on in the real world. Remember, we live in the real world alongside everyone else. We are useful allies. Carry on doing what you are doing because you are doing great work. Make sure the public hears about your reports, so write opinion pieces for publication in your regional newspapers and in the major newspapers. There's more and more opinion pieces being printed in newspapers these days, I've noticed. So, you know, take advantage of that. If you're a good writer, write an opinion piece for your local newspaper. Get it published. That's one of the ways in which to get the message out. Cultivate a working relationship with a junior reporter who is hungry for stories. Build the stories from the beginning, and over time, help them toward being good investigative journalists. Like many a keynote, I haven't really quite stuck to the title of my kōrero, but I hope I've done enough to encourage you to vote and to take an active part in the political fabric of our nation. By starting and looking at the policies of the various political parties, and spend some time talking to each other on how they affect Taiohinga, and last but not least, upping the political advocacy and strategising. Nō reira e hika mā, ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Thank you for making the time to come and listen to me this morning. Join me in the rest of the waiata we have started this morning. Wahine mā, karanga mai, maranga mai, kia kaha. Wahine mā, karanga mai, kia kaha. Ia, whakarongo tautoko. Ia, whakarongo tautoko. E tamama, tamatu, tamato, tamora. E tamama, tamatu, tamao, tamora. Ia, whakarongo tautoko. Ia, whakarongo tautoko. Kia ora koutou.
A kārere ngā mihi ati ki a koe te mārai kura e te kuia.